Marx was actually an accelerationist who wanted the ruling class to have their own government in Brussels and called it cosmopolitan.
Oh my God.
So things could get worse. This is What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Lillian, and here with me today is Owen, Gil, and Will. Hey, guys.
Hey. Hello.
So today our episode is about Raymond Geuss, and specifically his essay. It's a small book, long essay, called Philosophy and Real Politics. And when I was reading this again, we read the first half together, I was actually reminded of how much this book influenced me in graduate school, and I completely forgot that it did, and I just kind of felt myself talking back at me, and then I realized I've basically plagiarized, and that's
great opening.
crazy to realize this. Anyway, but the reason that I think this book was influential on me, just to get to the point, is that I think that there's a series of debates in political philosophy that I'm sympathetic to, that his position in these debates and what he's trying to address. And the first one is a big picture argument against a dominant strain in analytic political philosophy, which basically takes the form of politics as applied ethics. So you figure out what your principles are, and then you think, what is the difference between right and wrong, how ought the world to be in contrast to how the world actually is. And then we're going to pursue social criticism or analysis based on that framework. And I think, and this is just my interpretation, but I think normally the arguments against this way of doing philosophy, so the usual culprit would be Rawls or Neo-Kantian influenced views. Normally, people attack this by saying, it's what's important to do non-ideal theory. Like, non-ideal theory is the thing that is missing, because if you don't have an idea of what injustice is or what the bad things are or how the world actually is, then ideal theory is useless because, in Marx's, our favorite phrase from Marx, the point is to change it. And so we have this debate about ideal versus non-ideal theory. And if you're listening and that kind of makes sense to you, you've been sitting around and people normally the lefties or left liberals in the crowd will be like, ideal theory. And then they'll be like, non-ideal theory is so much more important. And so on it goes. But I actually think this is kind of a different view, because it kind of shows that debate, at least in my mind, is kind of a debate that's internal to a Rawlsian dominated discourse. And
Nice.
He argues that for a version of a way of doing political philosophy that just has a different set of tasks than that whole world of debate altogether, and he calls it realism. So he just argues that in the first place, the surface of what is going on, our real motivations, our justifications for why we're doing what we're doing, the constraints that we're under, what we think we're learning or what we're unlearning in the historical process, this all matters. And we're a lot less transparent to ourselves than we think as individuals and as groups, as in societies. But on the other hand, there's much we can find out by looking at what we're actually doing. And I actually wonder if this is kind of a turn back to a positivist way of looking at philosophy. What are people actually doing? What are their patterns, and why do they say that they're doing what they're doing? And so we want to figure out what the context of action is, and we want to do this in a historically specific and located way. So the level of abstraction that is required is just going to vary in time and space. And then think about politics as a craft or an art of people basically navigating this terrain. And he thinks that this framework, these four things, realism, action, historically located analyses, and politics as craft or art, he kind of thinks this is like the introduction to a Leninist model of doing political philosophy. And I think that claim is sort of interesting.
We love to see it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah. And then, so I'll just close by saying like some of the things that you would do with this kind of analysis, like the kinds of questions that you would answer is who is doing what to whom? So he says who, whom. And I think that's kind of important because it's about like, not just in the abstract, what is power, but who is exercising it and why. You want to build a map of people's priorities, preferences, and timing. You want to figure out why people think they should act in one way or another, so questions of legitimacy for political action. And then you want to do ideology critique. And I'll close it there because I love the ending of this part of the essay on ideology critique because this is a much maligned idea that we've discussed at various points on this podcast, but I just don't even know how you can do political philosophy like in an engaged way without doing ideology critique, even though it's very severely fallen out of fashion. And so I would say that not only is this a critique of neo-Kantian political philosophy, I think the realist perspective is also a critique of much anti-Kantian political philosophy, where instead of looking at rational individuals and trying to figure out what's right to do, we almost exclusively look at what they don't know that they're doing. And he's like, that's what I mean, like the surface matters for analysis. So yeah, what did you guys make of this one? I like this essay, obviously, so interested to hear what you guys got from it.
Yeah, I vibed extremely strongly. I mean, a lot of this just made immediate great sense to me. I think it I like so many of these things. The interesting synthesis that he's producing of different thinkers in this first part of the essay is wild, right? We have like Lenin asking a very sort of Hobbesian question, right? Like cui bono, right? Like who whom is such a cool question because he's like, look, all political matters they're actually about concrete people doing determinate things to other actually existing people for reasons, right? So like, I was thinking about it, like it was just going around on Twitter, one of the like classic cases that we get, a gunshot was fired by like a
gunshot
by
unfolded.
the police. A gunshot unfolded, right? And it's like, this is like a completely idealistic and sort of watered down, neutralizing, anti-political way of talking and thinking. Where the example he gives is you might encounter a statement like unemployment has risen by 5%. And that just sounds like a completely neutral fact, right? Just a statement about a state of affairs. It's like, actually what that means is some people who are in control of economic organizations have terminated the employment of other people, right? Like so to whom is like a really cool thing to keep in view, a thing to keep in focus, and tying it with these other sorts of questions of like legitimacy and like differential evaluation. I don't know. It just like spoke to me quite a bit.
Yeah, no, I love the invocation of the Hobbes like cui bono question, like who benefits, because the question for him is like who does what to whom. That's a crucial question of political philosophy, right? We're dealing in the terrain of actions, and in politics, people are acting on other people and with certain determinate benefits. I love the way he extends it. Because it applies to, because I think what he wants us to do is also to ask that question cui bono of like particular theoretical frameworks, right? Which was also Hobbes's question, right? When Hobbes introduced that expression cui bono and the question in Leviathan, he's trying to dispute the idea that ecclesiastic power has a kind of legitimate claim against secular sovereign power, right? So he says like these priests and all of these people defending ecclesiastic power, it sounds like they're making theoretical arguments with like just theoretical stakes. But you should ask yourself, like, who stands to benefit from their position being granted authority, right? Or from their position gaining, a level of social persuasion, right? And I think you could ask the same thing in our context. You could take an example, one that we've touched on a little bit, like Foucauldian thought. I think that being pressed to ask the question like cui bono, who benefits from this theoretical framework becoming, let's say, a dominant theoretical framework on the left? The charitable reading, right, would say that, well, people that have been marginalized in ways that class oppression, doesn't really fully account for, right? The people that are disabled, people that are queered in various ways by social norms and et cetera, right? But, another answer, maybe a more ideology critique focused answer might say, well, it looks like in a lot of ways, like the ruling class benefits from this particular framework gaining more traction because it prevents certain other kinds of questions from being asked about where real power centers are. If we just think power is diffuse and it's everywhere, whatever, like that might prevent us from just, doing good analytical and critical work on actual power centers and how it is being exercised in certain ways. I don't want to go on too long about this, but I love posing that cui bono question about our own theoretical practice in political philosophy. And even when we're using concepts and frameworks that might not seem to immediately lend themselves to one side of an antagonism or a partisan conflict,
Yeah, I like you all, I loved Cui Bono, but I also loved what's implied by him calling this philosophy in real politics, because I think he also tries to show that, so there are two ways of looking at the type of political theory he's critiquing. On the one hand, you could look at it and say, honestly, there isn't anything really political about it at all. It is simply just doing, abstract ethical theory about a world that it may or may not respond to, but does not even need to necessarily, and just working out these logical conclusions. But on the other hand, you could ask, a type of neutral political theory, political philosophy that takes politics to simply be about ideal ethics is a way of bracketing out real conflicts, real interpretations that are occurring amongst people, that it doesn't even do the work of clearing up conceptual confusions and trying to set people's perceptions right. I think that's one way of trying to justify that type of political philosophy. And he's trying to say that it even misunderstands the very essence of political engagement. And it does so, and maybe he doesn't go this far as saying it, in the name of a different type of politics, honestly. A politics that, tries to reduce contingency as much as possible and make almost politics simply administration, rather than the messy work of subjects who have partial, conflicting, confusing beliefs, who are caught in institutions of oppression and domination. And so I thought it was like even more interesting that he's like throwing down the gauntlet and saying, are you actually going to talk about politics, or are we just going to be doing, thought examples and thought experiments with each other in our nice little Ivy League schools, which is funny because he's at Cambridge, but he's a real one at Cambridge.
He's a real one.
We stand this Cambridge.
This is why I dislike the term "the political," which I feel like gained fashion in the 90s maybe, but I don't know when it came onto the scene. But the notion of like the political as a stable, transhistorical, ontological field that we can investigate.
The 90s were a dark time.
I'm telling you.
Sorry,
it was backwards.
No.
So
movies were all right.
Terrible time.
Let me call the Kantian admin, and if not, let me revive the political.
The Kantian admin. Hello, can you get the Kingdom of Ends online, please? What are you talking about? Oh, and you're gonna hate when we do Hannah Arendt. I can tell already. You're not gonna like it.
Let's go back earlier. I mean, Schmidt's really the culprit, I think, for that. The concept of the political, right? He tried to lay down basically a kind of, listen, I fucks with Schmidt. I think Schmidt's an interesting person to read, but he tried to lay down, a transcendental conception of the political. Hannah, that was obviously very influential for Hannah Arendt. So yeah, maybe we shouldn't blame the 90s totally. I think the 30s and the 20s and 30s.
The Nazis are worse.
The Nazis bear some responsibility.
It is nice to lay it at the Nazis.
Who would have guessed that the Nazis, not a great legacy.
Okay, but actually, though, interestingly, I mean, I agree. Schmidt's reification of the political, is a problem for sure. I think it's worse in the hands of someone like an Arendt, though. At least in Schmidt's hands, he's actually sensitive to some of these similar sorts of realist commitments that Geuss seems to have about how, hey, actually, this is going to be about interests, competing and vying interests
and motivations,
that might be and motivations, right? That have something at stake, and then the questions that we ask or don't ask or can't formulate properly has to be understood in light of these competing interests, right?
That's true.
Whatever else we want to say about Schmidt, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
in many ways a good realist political philosopher. And then other stuff as well.
another Hobbesian.
Yeah.
A Hobbesian.
Wow. So, what did you all think about what Geuss sees as the role of, like conceptual engineering with realist political philosophy? So, I take his point to be we shouldn't get confused that the concepts we use are immediately picking out entities that exist in the world. So he uses the state, and he tries to argue that the state, when it emerged as a concept, it wasn't pointing to something that was already there, but it was actually a modification of reality, an intervention into selecting specific problems and deselecting others, and and over time coalesces into what we now call the state. And so I even see him trying to make the argument, he's not trying to say something like, yeah, real politics is messy. Why are you all writing things down and doing theory? I think he's actually trying to say we should also be clear on what is theory's relationship to reality. How does it modify reality? But it's not a direct description of what is happening. And I thought that was like a really interesting move, because he could have gone the route of being like, we don't need any sort of theoretical interventions. It's all praxis. But that's not where he goes. He wants to show that the type of thought you generate is going to have impacts on reality. And so maybe you're fooling yourself if you're thinking, hey, I just run algorithms, man. I just do ideals, man. And so he's trying to call that attention as well.
I mean, that is one thing that I do want to question a little bit, because there are points in reading Geuss where I'm thinking that it sounds a lot like, and maybe this is what has to happen, I'm not a priori opposed to it, but it sounds at times like we're talking about the self-abolition of philosophy insofar as political philosophy has something distinct to offer. Because he's always, I'll come back to your example of the state in a second, but he's always insisting on further particularization, right? Like there are no transhistorical political norms that we can sit around and cultivate. There are no, even the kinds of values and the concepts that we use to critique social reality don't apply necessarily from one part of a society to another, from one time or historical epoch to another, et cetera, right? So you get to this level of the need for particularization, but philosophy isn't super good at particularization. Do you know what I mean? And like, do you know what I mean? And like even the examples, I mean, I don't even know if that's what it has, that's what its best resources or what its best offering is to theory, is that level of particularization. So this is an open question for me, because it's just one thing that made me pause and wonder, like, okay, well, I can think of lots of ways historically where concepts like the state, right, have been incredibly important, but in some ways, the state was already forming when the social contract. Okay, this is going to be interesting, I guess. Like when the social contract gets articulated by early modern thinkers, it's not that the social contract brings the state; those writings bring the state into existence. Nor is it the case that they're a mere reaction. I don't know. I guess there's some kind of dialectical relationship happening between the practical world and theory at that point. But I don't know. I'm just curious what you guys think about the limits to philosophy when you demand that when it has to be so historically rooted.
Yeah, that's true, but at the same time, he's also pretty clear that like generalization is powerful as well. Like, I mean, there are like moments when he talks about like conceptual innovation having this like generalizing function. I mean, which I think I agree with you that like philosophy is pretty bad at getting as particular as he wants it to be. I mean, so much of the text is like occasionally indirect, occasionally extremely direct, just like dunk after dunk on ideal theory, right? Just like, and I was almost shocked, but maybe I shouldn't have been, that like he doesn't name Rawls.
Yeah.
Does he name Rawls at all?
I think one,
like because it feels like it felt to me, and maybe this is just because like I've been reading and teaching him recently, it just like felt like we were just like trashing like Rawlsian political philosophy.
See, that's what I think is not happening. I mean, we could ask him. Maybe we should send him get in his DM, send him an email and see what he says. But
slide in.
Yeah. But like, I think he says Neocontinuism kind of specifically because that's broader than Rawls. Like that's the Anglophone and the German-speaking academic world, basically. I mean, when you think about Habermas, Rainer Forst, I mean, we're talking about like a big Kantian turn that is not reducible to Rawls. So I think that's why it's kind of more generalizable than the ideal theory debate.
So I was just going to ask, so maybe we can again kind of figure out why did he write this text. So I'm all for dunking and all of that, and I'm all for dunking on neo-Kantians especially. But so what actually does he think the relationship between philosophy and real politics should be, though? So I get describing the shortcomings of, sort of the non-ideal couplet, the lack of understanding of how politics, actually articulates, actually crystallizes. But I was wondering if we could get clear on what the positive part of this project is, because I've increasingly become interested in political realism and all of that, and I know that there's a certain strain of political realism where they don't want to depend on moral argumentation or moral norms, and yet I get the sense that there is an ought in Geuss's project. And so what should philosophy be doing? And maybe this can take us to some of what he was doing with ideology critique, because I think he does have a positive role for philosophy, but I'm not quite clear on what it is.
Well, one of the things I think makes his realism sophisticated is that part of the field of the real for him, of what is real for him, are values and concepts, right? Like they have... That's why he talks about legitimation for a while. Like legitimation it's not just an ideological epiphenomenon, right? There's a real task involved in understanding and critiquing what ideas and values are compelling to people, actually motivating to people at a given moment. And I guess maybe that's where philosophy's task lies, right? It lies in that domain, but not as, again, you don't want to inflate philosophy's role, because he seems to be trying to balance like not inflating philosophy while not obliterating it. So maybe my point about the self-abolition isn't totally fair.
Yeah, I mean, like he talks like continuously, and this is why I think he's drawn to ideology critique, unfashionable though it might be, right? Because he recognizes that like there's a real effectivity in the political register, or so in the construction of social reality, for ideas, beliefs, these concepts of what counts as legitimate, things that are desirable. And he completely brackets whether or not any of them are quote unquote correct, right? Like it has nothing to do with that at all, right? Like he says things like, hey, like, yeah, people sometimes are confused about what even they want. And if you ask them what they want, they're going to spit out a bunch of contradictory nonsense. And that plays a role in determining the things they're going to do and how they participate in constructing social and political reality, right? Like, and so like a realist political philosophy has to take that seriously. You cannot just be like, well, if everyone was rational, they'd be, well, who are you talking about? Those people don't exist. They're just not real, right? Real people are these contradictory, non-self-transparent, conflicted, invested, partisan, sometimes confused, sometimes clear, sometimes aware, sometimes like all way off the mark, working together to attain specific goals and against one another sometimes. Like and realist thinking has to, get down into that mud and like try to like look around and be like, where are we actually? Who's saying what? Why? Like, what do people actually think? So like toward the end, when he's talking about like the relationship between political philosophy or political theory, and he is explicit about like, I'm equivocating between the two. What's the relationship between political philosophy or political theory and ideology? He basically seems to suggest, and maybe you can tell me if I've got this right, that there's like two different modes of relating, right? One of them is like dissolving ideological formations, and the other is like playing a role in dissimulating them, perpetuating them, right?
Proposing them.
Or ingratiating them. I mean, I was thinking before, Owen, like you were bringing up the example of like a Foucauldianism, like that sort of does, I think, fit into that second model in as much as it like kind of intentionally takes our attention away from certain questions pertaining to class in ways that I think might be, like you said, then we can ask a cui bono question, right? So like it is to do with like how political theory, political thinking, we can try to do conceptual innovation. I really wish there was more of a roadmap there because like it's really difficult. But sometimes it's about like what questions you draw attention to, what you allow to remain as presupposed as natural, or what you call into question.
What stood out to me about that, though, is that if I try to think of examples, so he gives the one example of the concept of the state. But if I try to think of other examples, and I can think of some, right, where concepts have this kind of way of concentrating a problem in the practical field, this way of like orienting action. the first things that come to my mind are not concepts that are like generated and necessarily discussed even in like political philosophy. So I think of like MLK Jr.'s concept of like the white moderate, right, which allows to like concentrate under this particular figure a whole set of social and political forces that were not maybe able to be, they're not able to be critiqued in the same way, right? When he's able to show that, look, it's not the Klansman, right? It's this figure of the white moderate, and then he fills in the white moderate with a conceptual field that surrounds it, right? Which is things like people that, the people that privilege order over justice, right? People that are always talking about things going slow enough or whatever, right? Or I think of, as another example, the Black Panther Party and the naming of like the figure of the pig, the concept of the pig. And the concept of the pig orients the practical field. That's a concept, right? That orients the practical field. It names a problem, and it is able to also motivate. I don't know. It has a certain. You just even though those aren't concepts that are developed in political philosophy, though. Those are like
no.
Theoretical.
You don't have Rawls talking about behind the veil. We have to just think about if you're going to be a pig or not. No,
Yeah, exactly. But like those are now. To be fair, those are theoretically inflected political practitioners, right? MLK Jr. and like the Panthers, Marxist-Leninists. So it's not to say that they're. That theory, I'm just trying to think through it because it's not that theory is not a part of it. Again, I come back to this question of, I just want to know, I have a better sense of like, well, what in political philosophy then in these fucking articles, like in these books, like are we supposed to be doing to be faithful to what I think are fantastic premises for, a realist political theory?
So here's something that, as you were talking, one, I actually think that was a fantastic example of MLK and the white moderate, because what I got from that is, well, maybe, the relationship of philosophy to real politics is also to understand that politics is always going to be a movement of selecting and deselecting what you take to be salient. If you have an idea of politics in which it grasps every single problem at every single scale at the exact same moment, that sounds like a fantasy politics. And so, to have even the fantasy of a philosophical theory that can completely grasp the political, all of its, its requirements, its needs, the values and ideals it should have, well, maybe Geuss's critique would be that isn't actually engaging what politics actually does, which is it is this foregrounding and backgrounding, and that those are inevitable trade-offs that will happen, but also there can be really good effects. I think when you said the white moderate example, I thought, all of a sudden MLK shifts the field, he shifts your orientation to the battle we're fighting isn't against this explicit racist. It makes apparent a field of power and a stricture on political movements that had been either inchoate or simply implicit. But that means, when you do that, obviously MLK, if you ask him, he wouldn't be like, I'm cool with the Klan, but he is backgrounding them. And so that isn't what we are focusing on now. And so maybe this constant oscillation of what are we focusing on, what are we seeing, and being self-conscious that we are creating these lenses to view and focus on specific issues.
Yeah, I thought that like one of the things that he said that I thought was really striking was that the process of conceptual innovation, or like, these moments where like a new concept comes to light and he talks about them like putting down roots, right? Sometimes they like put down roots or take hold, and sometimes they don't. Yeah. And one of the questions for political theory is like trying to look at these cases and sort of try to figure out why sometimes they do and sometimes they don't take hold. But like, it's not just naming something that already exists. It's also not just like naming something that you want to be and you're trying to like call it into existence. It's sort of like entering into an entire already normatively laden theoretical space, right? And like surveying it from a particular perspective so that, there's oughts built into
that's important.
Each of these conceptual innovations, like no matter what. Like, so in the case of like the white moderate, like there is an ought there, right? That is like one ought to combat the white moderates' recalcitrance in the face of progressive, like anti-racist movement, right? Like
same with the concept of the pig, right? It creates a friend-enemy distinction against the police.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so like these are both really interesting features of this kind of work of political theory that he's describing, right? Like that it is the conceptual work of constructing adequate ways of getting a grip on how social reality is parsed in a normative way. And then this other question of like, when does that work and why, right? Because sometimes it does and sometimes it does not, right? And the example that he gives of it not, and that could be for different reasons, right? Sometimes it's because of the conceptual deficiencies. The example he gives there is like the third way.
Oh, yeah.
He's like, well, that just wasn't.
Oh,
That just like
new
wasn't
labor.
a thing.
Yeah, yeah. They tried to come up with a
new
concept.
labor. He's like, that's just not real. So
He says it instead of being a concept, new labor was just a slogan.
just a slogan, right? And sometimes people name things that they think are concepts, but they're slogans. Sometimes it's because it's just not attractive enough or not plausible. And sometimes it's just not even clear at all, right? And so like there's like a lot of work actually for political philosophy to do here, trying to sort of diagnose the moment. That was this is the other thing. Maybe I'm going to shut up, but I like the other thing that I was fascinated by was like he goes to Lenin for the idea of like the moment, like the conjuncture.
The propitious
right? Like
moment.
The now.
Kairos.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like there's the new labor thing is sparking an idea for me, because what I wanted to say, and the reason that he uses Lenin, is it's almost like Lenin is somebody who is just from a different space and time, where the kind of political thinking that Geuss is interested in is not alien. And there's a sense in which Lenin helps us understand our own deficiencies. So like when we were talking about in the Sartre episode that we did, and I suggested that like the way that we do political philosophy now is a symptom of a particular kind of institutionalized specialization, such that we even have to ask the kinds of questions that we're asking. And previous generations of people wouldn't have had to ask this question, this ideal, non-ideal theory thing, because they didn't live in a context in which that kind of distinction even made sense. Like what philosophy was for was understood to be something different. Likewise, with Lenin, what politics was something different to him. And it's something that at least Geuss seems to think this part of Lenin you can try to bring back, which is that like you just have to assume that the people you're dealing with, your object of study, is not the kind of thing that you project on it. And this is something that like in theory, I mean, and this is something that I think people, at least on the political left, are starting to learn again. That is kind of a really painful learning process from like the Corbyn campaigns or the Bernie campaigns, that when you go out and you talk to people, it's not the case that they look at the world and then what you see reflected back at you is what you learned in your university classroom. People don't have completely systematic ideas. Their unconscious does not say the things that your psychoanalysis class on social issues told you that it would say, unless you reach for that. Like they'll send you a little signal and you'll be like, aha, that's it. That confirms my worldview.
I mean, that's what's great with Freudian psychoanalysis. Whatever happens, just like,
Right.
I've got enough theory for that.
Yeah. So like you can kind of, and he's like, maybe there's a sense of wonder and problem solving that needs to be revived here, that this distinction between political theory and philosophy is itself ideological and is obscuring what we're supposed to be doing, and that can only happen in a historical period that is distinctly not politically engaged in the ways that someone like Lenin or anyone in that milieu would have, like they would have looked at our world and been like, what are you doing? Literally, what are you doing?
How is this political philosophy? I could imagine that, because as soon as you were talking, while you were talking, Lillian, I just kept thinking it isn't even that they weren't thinking in terms of ideal, non-ideal theory. Like, did they even have that language? Like, when did that linguistic concept enter into a milieu? And this kind of shows you the power of the effectivity of concepts when they articulate with institutions, that it shapes a whole form of life and normative milieu, where this is a central real salient, obviously pertinent question where in a different historical period, it would be like, it seems like you created a problem to solve that wasn't there in the first place. And so, I don't mean, sometimes I always worry about, dunking too much, but sometimes, I look at some political philosophy and I ask, how is this not just us talking to each other? I know at the end of every paper we're supposed to say, and here is actually the real world payoff of everything I did. And at a certain point, I'm not convinced. And I am not convinced that like what you are doing is the same as, the political speech act of like MLK or Marx or Lenin, not to deify them, but you cannot tell me that that is the same. And you should be able to explain why that is different. And so it's actually fascinating that it also allows us to reflect on what it is we've been doing and, to see how we have gotten ourselves wrong. We have, been projecting onto ourselves. Never mind you projected onto other people, and it turns out if you actually meet them, they don't think the way you said that they do. But maybe we don't even think the way that we think we do. That we assume that we are, the standard bearers, the ones who are going to change culture and all of that. And really what we are doing is just becoming increasingly more and more irrelevant. And we should ask how and why that is, which leads me to what Geuss said. I think a really important thing for political philosophy to do is also to ask why failures happened, why certain concepts didn't take root, why they failed to do the work. Like new labor, maybe a type of psychoanalysis, but we are going to do a psychoanalysis episode at some point, so I want to hold off on our dunking on that. Let's figure out if it fails. But I think that's like a really important question to ask, because it allows you to become clearer on the forces that animate the world in which you live. And so sometimes I worry that a type of leftist thinking is just constantly trying to shove a square block into a circle hole and just mean like, I guess we didn't believe hard enough. And and always coming up with cope reasons why the world that you think should be here is not here. And it's like, I don't know what to tell you. Maybe your priors are wrong. Not to go all analytic philosophy. Check your priors.
One of these premises is false.
Yeah, gotta be, right? That's gotta be.
One of them is false. This is, in fact, not a sound argument.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. So, I completely buy now. I'm convinced by both you, Will and Lillian, that thinking about this as a specifically a critique of quote unquote ideal theory is in part missing the point, because part of what he's trying to do is to shake up the presupposition that that's even the right distinction. But it is also true, I think, that some of the ways in which political philosophy as currently institutionalized and formalized goes about trying to do the work that it does is just untenably idealist, just kind of wild, that it would even come to this, right? To sort of repeat what you were just saying, are you kidding me, right? Are you serious? You're going to
how long are we gonna let this go on?
Yeah, are you for real?
Why didn't someone stop this train?
Why
before it got
someone
going?
stop this? We're trying to talk about power, and it's all right, well, let's just sit around and just imagine what power is metaphysically, absent historical circumstances, and
Maybe
what are you
not even
talking?
metaphysically. Let's wonder about the linguistic definitions of these words that we're using.
Yeah. Let's try to clarify the words that we use to ourselves so as to be able to make maximally rational, by which we mean utilitarian, min-maxing. What are you talking about? This is bananas.
So whose benefit? For whose benefit is this?
For whom is it good that this is what quote unquote political philosophers do?
I mean, I guess it's good for getting tenure. I mean,
that's
seems
facts.
to be
That's facts.
And you know what? Anyone listening to this, don't you dare at me. Don't you dare deny that's not good for tenure. Get out of here with that. Come on now.
So I mentioned before that, I was surprised he doesn't name Rawls, but he does name Habermas quite often. I was curious what you all thought of that. Habermas seems to be his go-to example of the sort of non-realist approach to political philosophy that he's got a lot of problems with. I was wondering what you all thought about that.
He went after the self-proclaimed last living Marxist. How could you
I forgot about that claim.
That's
so
your
killer.
bro. It's powerful.
Yeah.
Does he really say that? I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's a real thing Habermas said. This is why, I'm always going to be stand by Habermas. I mean, I guess like
Wait, when did he say that?
Yeah, that's bananas.
I swear he said it. It must maybe it was like 30 years ago.
I believe you.
When he was in a different period, but I swear a theory of communicative action was already
in a different
out.
place in his
He was in a
life.
different place
Yeah.
in his life, but I think volume 1 of theory of communicative action was out. So I don't know what to tell you. If I'm wrong, sorry Habermas, I didn't mean to slander you. But
Marx was actually an accelerationist who wanted the ruling class to have their own government in Brussels and called it cosmopolitan.
Oh my god.
So things could get worse and worse in Europe after two world
it's
wars.
crypto-Marxism. You really got to read beneath the text and between the lines. I mean, I've read some Habermas, and I think he's hard on the guy, but it's hard for me to understand how he's wrong. I mean, especially more later Habermas and all of that. And so it seems to me that Geuss's issue with Habermas is around one of his Habermas's concepts around the ideal speech situation. And I think maybe Geuss doesn't put it this way. What he doesn't like in a type of Habermasian approach is even the idea that there could be some type of neutral space in which we can imagine if we had all the time in the world, theoretically this is how we'd work through all of these issues. And he thinks again this mischaracterizes that politics is finite. It's
pressed for time.
It's temporally bounded, and is pressed for time,
Yeah,
and that's
pressed.
what makes it, it essentially.
Yeah.
That's not a contingent attribute of politics, a sort of
Nice.
unfortunate degradation, a deformation of what it ideally ought to be, even if, like Habermas would never say, like the ideal speech situation ever comes. I don't think he does that. I think he's careful enough not to say that, but it's still to configure these as malformations, this time-bound form of politics as distortions. And Geuss wants to say it's not distortion. That is politics, though.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a fundamental condition, right? Like sometimes he says at one point, which is really nice, that like politics is neither, or maybe political theory isn't found either in those cases where one is like just fully kind of captured by like the obvious desirability of a particular outcome, right? So that like, your action just sort of follows as a matter of obvious course, nor in those moments where like you have, quote, all the time in the world to like sit around and figure. It is these moments of constrained decision, of choice, of needing to try to prioritize or select. And this is why I liked language you were using, Will, before about like how maybe then like explicitly the work of political philosophy is like selection, deselection, right? Like that's like, yeah, and that is always time bound. We are pressed for time. The moment is now, right? So our question should be something like, well, what's appropriate now and why, right? Like it's always why this here. I never do this, but like this is like a Deleuze thing for me. I never talk about on the pod how much I'm indebted to Deleuze, but like he says at some point something like, yeah, the questions change substantially when you're no longer asking them in this sort of classical mode of metaphysics that we inherit from Plato, where the question is like, what is X, right? What is virtue? What is justice? What is the good? When instead you start asking these questions like, why this now, right? Why this thing here, right? Like those are
Why
just
this conception of the good now?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that might be like a kind of core feature of this sort of more realist approach.
I mean, so here's an example of like why I mean, I don't know if this is a helpful example, but there's this debate that like I'm kind of involved in about the nature of domination under capitalism. Like, what is it? And some people think that the best way to describe, actually most people I would say, think the best way to describe domination is as impersonal, right? Because the market affects us basically statistically and impersonally. And there's the whole alienation critique. This is wildly outside of the control of any individual. And then, Marx says things about capitalists being the persona of capital, so capital is itself the subject. And like, this is just a classical way of talking about domination. And like, I've asked myself, like, do I think that's fundamentally wrong? And the answer is not really. Like, I think that that is one way of talking about domination, but I also think that, like, that isn't what's needed right now. Like, people already feel powerless enough, and telling people that they're dominated impersonally just to me seems, what are we going to do about that? You know? And so I'm obsessed with why capitalists actually do what they do, and why they, as individuals and as a group, do things that arbitrarily fuck people up and, like, make life miserable for people, that, like, displace them, that throw them away, that, like, what are they actually doing? Because I think if you can answer the question of why they are doing what they're doing, then you can say something more meaningful about how to challenge them and make them do something else. And so, like, to me, that's the kind of thing, like, when that kind of question, like, whom, or ideology critique, it's like, you ask yourself, and whether people agree with that, I don't know, but I ask myself, you can repeat that domination is impersonal until you're blue in the face, and it is not going to get anyone to see this problem any differently, because they can't do anything about that. And so maybe that's not what is required at this time, and the intervention that's just what I think. So, like, I just imagine that that's at least what I would kind of hope is, like, that's the kind of move that, because it's not like I'm saying something without normative justification, and it's not even that I'm saying there's a different way of answering the question is impossible. I'm just saying that this is a better way of making sense of this right now for these historical reasons. And I think that, to me, that's, like, a little bit more like a realist motivation for doing something like that.
I wonder, and I'm going to do something I hate when my undergraduates do. Let me play devil's advocate for a second. So I'm wondering if there is a type of limitation that, the political philosopher, whomever they are, who we've been dunking on, might respond. And they might say something like, all of this is fair enough, but what if we take it that the task of political philosophy is to give us some first order values or norms to guide us to, where or what configuration of society we want. Their critique might be being so enmeshed in the real, that how do you decide between better and worse configurations of society except by pure arbitrary caprice or pure bias? And so, I don't think, Geuss is, like, caught in this trap, but I think it's a question worth raising, because it seems to me he dethrones philosophy from being a place of sort of first order values or meta norms, if you will, and is quite a bit more, I don't mean this in a pejorative way, parasitical. It is dependent on the situation in which it finds itself in. And I can imagine some political philosophers, and again, we can immediately tag them and say, so you're not interested in politics, but want some independence from how things are, some autonomy from how things are, in order to reflect and not be, caught up in simply the circumscription of what is. Geuss kind of responds to this in one of my favorite quotes, where he talks about we shouldn't hamstring ourselves with, the Kantian baggage of, we necessarily can't imagine something, so it's beyond our limits. And he has this really funny line where he says, sometimes when you try to, like, explain something to someone, they can't imagine, you say, yes, I can see that. Let me explain further. Or, yes, I can see you can't imagine that. You poor thing. I don't know what's wrong with you. And so
let's get you some help.
Let's get you some help. But, I link that because, Geuss clearly doesn't think that, his realism traps you in, simply affirming the status quo of now. And, like, he seems to want to argue that political philosophy actually operates as a way of, authenticating or trapping itself in the status quo. But I'm wondering, based on what we've said, what is our way out of that, supposed political philosopher who's like, so you've given up on grounding any values and you're simply reactive?
I think that's a really good question. I also think grounding values and being simply reactive are two different problems. Like, there's So think about a debate about merit, like in the Rawlsian tradition, that you need to, no, not merit, fair equality of opportunity. You need like fair equality of opportunity. That's a part of the basic set of two principles of justice. It's part of the second one, as far as I understand. And in an ideal society, there would be fair equality of opportunity. We can talk about why that's so, and you can talk about why we don't have it now. And I might actually agree that like in a society in which that was a historical possibility to have fair equality of opportunity, I can fuck with that. I'm like, that might be a dope part of my way of thinking about justice under different rules. But that might in fact be, and this is the ideology critique or the unmasking part of the program, which is like, so that could be cool. Like that's a value you can ground. But what you have to react to is the fact that like that is in this context in which that's not historically possible. So that's not that it's a value you can justify normatively, but like you choosing to focus on it like this is also implicitly justifying this other thing. And maybe that's domination. So the status quo justification might just go in the other direction, which doesn't mean that those norms aren't viable some way, somehow.
Yeah. I mean, the concept of democracy is another example in which like there might, because it seems to be one of the things he's saying is that there are some conjunctures in which valorizing democracy can play like a critical role in projects of emancipation, and other instances in which like, and we could discuss whether this is one of those historical moments now or other moments in which it's kind of being defanged. It's not able to currently pry itself away from its status as ideological legitimation of, the existing political order.
Yeah, I like what you're saying there, because also, what that makes me also think is that, there's sometimes this way of speaking politically that, if we don't hold firm to quasi-eternal values, we're absolutely lost. But it also seems to run in the exact opposite direction, that hanging on to values or continuing to, press concepts that clearly aren't hooking into reality, that aren't, either shaping it or illuminating it in ways that open the path to, new forms of action, concepts like the third way, that increasingly it seems like people are like, okay, that's a nice slogan, or people actually kind of sense that you only mean it as a slogan, then there needs to be some sort of lever that can react upon political philosophy or political theory and say, we need to shift gears. What are the inbuilt mechanisms for, a way of thinking to figure out this is not working? And no, I don't think the answer is peer review. So,
but I'm stuck. I'm like stuck on your question though, Will. Like, I'm like thinking about like the objection that like a more idealistically minded philosopher would say in response to this. Like, surely the objection would run, a Geuss or a realist political philosopher more broadly does in fact have some kind of metanormative commitments, right? Like, and I'm noticing the way in which like that's sneaking back into the accounts that you all have just been giving, like where things like emancipation, right? Like for emancipatory projects, or liberatory, or words like this, like those imply, again, a fully normatively laden conceptual terrain in which there are already commitments staked out, right? Like, if you think that that's good, it's because you think emancipation's good. That's okay, own it, right? Like, but that's different than, but this is like, the question is like, why though? Not to just be difficult, but like if this realist account of like politics is about like trying to ask the question of, why this value now? Maybe this is where we should start asking ourselves questions. Like, again, and not just to be difficult, but like, why is emancipation a good thing? Actually, why are we all on board with that? Maybe that's something that, that's the sort of worry that I start to have when I hear that objection you were raising properly.
Well, my worry is though, is that we end up down a Nietzschean road in which we start, Nietzsche loves those questions like, why peace? Why not rather war? Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Get it, Nietzsche.
Nietzsche. Got him. Got him. Why not? I mean,
Fair question.
Fair question. Yes, no. We know Owen is probably closer to the side of maybe we should blow up some pipelines. I don't know. Like, I'm just asking questions. I'm just asking questions.
I'm just asking.
I mean, voting is an option too.
Voting's also an option. Thanks. I'll write that. Let me wait.
Voting is
Hold on.
also
Let me
an
write
option,
that down. You can vote. All right.
You hadn't thought about that before until Owen gave you that concept.
I've never thought about that before.
You are welcome. But
Thank you.
It is a scary question, but I tend to think that a reasonable answer that still adheres to the realism is that this question should remain uncomfortable insofar as we have to continue to furnish arguments for why this concept or this value now, rather than assuming it's a settled affair, but also with the self-consciousness that you are making an intervention. And if it is the case that in realist politics, agents can be confused, they can be partial, they can be misled, why in the world would you think that that doesn't go for you too? And maybe that's partially, sometimes I feel myself getting animated about political philosophy because I'm like, oh, so you all somehow escaped ideology, though. That's incredible. That is incredible. I love that.
Sounds
for you.
cool.
And so,
yeah, I love that. For you.
So maybe it forces us to continue to reckon with our partiality, not in a way foregoing truth, because I think all of us are actually kind of okay with capital T truth,
pro-truth podcast.
Pro-truth gang, rise up.
But you are also not guaranteed to be the one person who has all of it. No one ordains you in that. And so it seems to me it has to be a question you constantly return to. And the final reason I think you have to return to it is things like emancipation. It also forces you to ask, is that a universally shared value? Especially with the content you're attaching to it. Is that what we all think? And I see I was about to do it. We all love using we. And sometimes that we does a lot of work that might be, kind of denial or a flight from reality and actually tarrying with its, tensions rather than, saying, well, for obviously we are all on board with this thing called emancipation or liberation. You have to make the claim. You have to make the argument. You have to stake it into an already normatively laden field.
So I guess I just think that I'll just kind of rephrase what I said, that I'm not sure that even having like a metanormative picture has to be idealist to begin with. Like,
right, nice.
I think what I said when like there are lots of values that can be justified in ways that like might fit a metanormative framing for what people think is just and good. I think what Geuss is pointing out is that the leap from that to basically anything else is like, what are you going to do now? So I might have such a justification, but the norms that become relevant, like assuming that I am one of those people that just like has a system and I am transparent to myself and I have all my views and commitments sorted, like what I choose to emphasize in any particular situation has to differ based on that situation. And there's a choice on what I spend my time doing. So you can tell me, yes, like Lillian, you already have a way of thinking about the world that's implicit and you haven't fessed up to it. But then like, what if I do fessed up to it? Like, what's your point then? Like, does that mean that you're going to change? Like, do you have better norms to emphasize in this context than I do? And why? So I guess I just don't think that the realist move is that high stakes and that more meta framing sense. Like I think you could have one and still be a realist. I think the problem is in the reverse move, which is like, I have this framing and I am just going to impose it on the world and not ask myself what I am highlighting or de-emphasizing or whatever.
I mean, yeah, the anti-realist position might be then like to have no curiosity about how the kind of meta-normative frameworks with which you're working are rooted in and responsive to and act in the world, right?
Because then
Yeah.
otherwise you're not going to be able to like say whether or not you still agree with that framing, which is why it all gets so stuck. Like if you have a metanormative framework and say it's even metaethical, I don't know, and then you don't need to look at the world, then you're just only going to continue to confirm that in a way that's internal to your arguments, and you're never going to even find out if you really agree with that metanormative framing. Because sometimes we engage in politics and then you're like, the background, what's in the background here is not right to me anymore. And
the metanormative framework has to, it has to, be brought to bear on itself. I'm writing something up right now, and I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but it's me responding to my imagined critics on utopia. But what utopia allows is making clear the meta frameworks we already have and making them available for conceptual mediation, argumentation. But if you assume that you got it scot-free, then you'll never have to question it. It will all just remain internal and thus outside the tensions and cleavages of real politics.
Yeah, I mean, if not, whatever else is true about political philosophy, it can't just be self-confirmation, right? And like so much of Geuss's like intervention here throughout is just being like, here's what it would take to be self-critical, which you gotta do it. I'm sorry, you really need to be self-critical.
All right, well, that does it for us today, I think. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks wherever you get your podcasts. Also check us out on YouTube for videos and live streams. Before closing out today, we'd like to take a minute to thank some of the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. We couldn't do this without you, and we're really grateful. Today's new patrons are Rivka, Akshay Rangamani, Wendy, David Howell, Brian Kapsky, Robert Freudenthal, Sylvie Primus, Aaron Dowdy, Brad Pasanek, Sophie Whitlinger, Sean Fremstad, Lauren Shervington, Scott, Brian, Xylem Graff, Louise Wise, Billy Godfrey, and Ben Bauscher. Thank you all very much. If you too like what we're doing and want to support the show, please subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/leftofphilosophy. Patrons get access to exclusive content like locked episodes and bonus videos. Follow us on Twitter at leftofphil, and don't forget to leave us good reviews and comments on your podcast app, please. With that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.